Alright, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to another video here on the channel, and today, man, I want to talk about Nintendo as a company in general, right? Because recently there's been a lot of headlines going around, and this is kind of a subject that I personally have some personal insight into and like a personal passion for. I obviously really love retro games, old games, really the entire history of games in general, and there's a pretty massive problem in the gaming industry where incredible games, incredible works of art have just been completely abandoned and forgotten by all these massive corporations and these publishers, people hanging on to IP, doing nothing with it, and Nintendo, they're, I would say, one of the top offenders on this list, right? I mean, think of all of the classic titles that they've made over the last 40 or so years of gaming history. Well, 95% of them are unattainable for a decent retail price in a reliable way. If you're somebody like me, I'm trying to collect the entire GameCube collection. That's one of my personal projects I'm working on right now. You basically have to buy every game second rate. And of course, that means you're buying them used, you're buying games that they're coming from other people. You have to worry about the quality of them when you pick them up. The prices are outrageous. I mean, obviously some titles are going for thousands of dollars depending on their rarity and the conditions that they're in, things like that. But recently there's been a lot of news around a very specific lawsuit involving Nintendo where they went against these Switch emulators, more specifically the one that you're gonna know or have probably heard about at this point if you're watching this video is Yuzu, right? Which it was a Switch emulator, and obviously recently they've been in a pretty big legal dispute with Nintendo. Nintendo claims that the emulators are contributing to piracy at this massive scale. They're using Nintendo's intellectual property for profit, and it's really kind of re-sparked this long-term, I feel like, argument with Nintendo against emulators and ROMs and whatnot. Essentially, Nintendo, in my opinion, and in a lot of other people's opinions, they constantly will go against emulation and whatnot, claiming it's piracy, but at the same time, they are the reason that emulation exists on the scale that it does, and their constant attempts to disrupt it not only prove the need for emulation even more, which, by the way, emulation is 100% legal. Don't let these idiots online who don't know what they're talking about try to tell you it's not. But they just keep proving the need for emulation and why it should exist in the first place. So this recent case between Nintendo and Yuzu, I almost mixed those two up there for a second, it got a lot of attention. It got a lot of eyeballs on it, and there's obviously a lot of people who were upset that Nintendo got this settlement out of court and technically took the dub in court. And then there were some people who were defending Nintendo, you know, oh, but Nintendo has to protect their IP rights, man. They're protecting their copyright, bro. This is their property. And, you know, these mostly are people who are either misinformed or they know that they're wrong and they just usually are putting brand/corporate allegiance before sense. So the massive contributor that really kind of led to this whole Nintendo Yuzu issue was that Yuzu had a Patreon where people who were fans of the emulator or whatever could essentially pay a monthly subscription to the developers to obviously help support them, because from what I know, these people working on Yuzu were doing it full time. Like this project or whatever became a full-time thing for them, and they were trying to, you know, use Patreon to basically make some money for doing this. Now, that is kind of the problem/gray area with emulation, is people think the emulation is illegal, and that's not the case. You are 100% within your rights to emulate video games. When it really becomes like a problem, or like Nintendo in this instance can really get a win in, is when people who are basically making emulators, especially ones that do in some way incorporate Nintendo's intellectual property or another company's, depending on what's going on, right? Like, obviously at that point, it basically becomes monetizing their IP. And in this case, apparently the people working on Yuzu, the people like were going through their Patreon or whatever, they would get like early access to specific features. I think at one point they were like actually dumping ROMs of a Nintendo game, like basically the day that it came out. I can't remember which title it was off the top of the head. It's also not in the article that I'm referencing from Engadget. But at that point, right, you know, when that's what's going on behind this paywall or whatever, it gives Nintendo legal reason to say, oh, hey, these guys are profiting off of our shit. That's why some emulators have been able to stay up and been able to kind of get through any sort of controversy or possible scrutiny from corporations, and some of them, especially the ones that go down the paywall route, really at all, they end up getting sniped. Now, people make the argument, oh, the people who make these emulators deserve to be paid for their work, things like that, right? And typically I would agree too, but I mean, at a certain point, you have to understand about flying too close to the sun. Now, I'm not saying it's awesome that Nintendo can win like this, but I mean, it is legal precedent. These guys really had no chance, I personally feel like, in court with Nintendo. They would have never been able to have financed a lawsuit against a global corporation. I think we all know this, but then, like I said, there's people who are like, I feel like very misinformed about what emulation is, what the legal boundaries of it are, where, you know, people seem to think that just because you have an emulator and you play a Nintendo game through an emulator that you're somehow robbing Nintendo of money or stealing money from Nintendo, right? Like, oh, you have Dolphin emulator on your PC and you happen to be playing a copy of fucking Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, which at this point in time is probably exponentially more expensive than its initial retail price on the aftermarket. Oh my God, you're a fucking criminal. And this is where the problem for me personally comes in, right? Like Nintendo, they want to pretend, oh, we're doing this for our copyright. We're doing this for our IP. This is our right. But then Nintendo doesn't want to actually amicably solve this problem, right? Like, obviously, some people are still going to emulate no matter what. People are going to pirate games no matter what. That is literally impossible to stop. There's no way to. Billion-dollar corporations have been trying for decades to stop piracy. It has never worked. All it does is continue people's, like, I guess, run on piracy. It makes them want to pirate more. It eventually becomes like one of those Hydra situations, right? Where like you cut one head off, oh, we ended piracy here. Oh, well, 3 more popped up over here now. It's not stoppable. But there are also people like myself who, a pretty big reason why I emulate a lot of games, specifically old Nintendo games, is because as now I'm trying to collect them physically, it becomes impossible to actually get verifiable quality products for a fair price when it comes to picking up these physical games again. I mean, I just went into my local game store about a week and a half ago, right? And they had just gotten a copy of Pokemon Coliseum for GameCube, and they also had just gotten a copy of Gale of Darkness, which for me, I've never been able to find that in store, right? I've gone to the 2 stores that I constantly frequent. They have never had a copy of this game in store that I've been able to see. It's always been sold like the day they get it. So I'm lucky enough to go there and get these games as they get them in. I spend over $400 for 2 GameCube games, okay? These are games that, you know, back in the day when they came out, right? You could have got them from anywhere from what, depending on your market, $30 to $60, depending on sales, used titles, things like that, right? But yeah, 2 copies of these games, $400 fucking dollars. And you know what? I don't mind spending that at a local store, right? Like, these are people in my community running a game store. I'm giving them money. They're getting a fucking profit off of this. I'm supporting a business in my community. But ultimately, Nintendo right now, if they didn't want me and so many other people to emulate games and shit like that, they didn't want this market to exist so badly, they could do the proper job of actually archiving and, you know, showing the respect to their catalog that it deserves. Nintendo would still be issuing or selling copies of these games, right? I mean, if right now I could go on Nintendo's website and I could buy a copy of Pokemon Coliseum for GameCube for $59.99 US and have it shipped to my house in a fucking Mario box and dropped off at my front door, I would be happy to give Nintendo that money. I would be happy to purchase that product. But of course, that is not the world we live in. That is not the market environment that Nintendo has set up, or really any of these other major companies set up. And so yeah, when you're talking about people having, hey, I want to get a couple Pokemon games, oh, you have to spend $600 at a local store, or go on DK Oldies and probably get ripped off there, or Marketplace or eBay or wherever and get ripped off there. And to be fair, a lot of people in the gaming community selling these titles, they're not ripping people off. They're not sending scratch discs and whatnot, but it does happen. I mean, there are cases where you're going to buy a game, you know, you buy a bundle of games or whatever, and some of them just don't work. I mean, physical media eventually corrodes, you know, it wears down over time. If people don't store it in the right conditions, there's so many different factors and multitudes that really go into shit like that realistically would never be a problem if Nintendo really cared enough about this issue. It's like, you guys care enough to go to court and sue and get money like that, but you don't care enough to just sell me the fucking product directly and make sure that this whole middleman shit doesn't have to happen, that people don't have to download emulators and go to places online to find ROMs. And that's the thing, is people act like this is the first time this has happened and like, oh, well, Nintendo is just standing up. No, they're not standing up. Nintendo has had a very long history of just being such an anti-consumer company. I mean, ultimately, just because they won in court doesn't mean this isn't some shady bullshit. Like, if Nintendo had it their way, tomorrow every emulator and ROM website would cease to exist. And as a result, a massive amount of the preservation of these media forms and these games and their manuals and whatnot, right? These things would all cease to exist. And then we would literally be reliant on these games being sitting in a hard drive at Nintendo's fucking HQ where, you know, maybe eventually they'll re-release one of these games as an emulated version on their console that you can buy for profit there. But God forbid if you use an emulated version on your home computer or whatever, right? That's where they draw the line on emulation. It's just such a fucking ridiculous concept constantly to see Nintendo just doing the wrong thing for the consumer. And I mean, even just outside of like going after ROMs and emulators, like Nintendo has always had a really stupid fucking copyright policy. I mean, I'm old enough to remember doing YouTube back in the day, a decade ago, when if you actually put Nintendo gameplay in your videos, they would issue copyright on your videos, or they would try to take like a cut of the revenue since you were playing their games on YouTube. Like at a time where games like Minecraft, through the power of the internet and through YouTube and shit, were just going nuclear, just selling out constantly, just shipping out all these fucking copies just all over the world because of things like YouTube and that word of online mouth. In a time where that was becoming popular, Nintendo was the sole people on the mountaintop that had the fucking gall to actually take a dump on content creators for trying to literally play and promote their games. Nintendo has had a long history of targeting emulators and ROM websites and things like that. And keep in mind, these are websites that are 100% legal. Like, if these are places that actually had no basis in law, they would have been gone a long time ago. But as a result of the fact that emulation is legal and dumping ROMs of games is not technically illegal unless you're just fucking giving anyone and everyone a copy of it or whatever, right? Like, it's just a massive gray area, and Nintendo is trying their hardest to encroach on it as far as they can. And as a result, the consumer ultimately loses because Nintendo has no interest in actually solving the problem. They just want to punish you for basically dealing with the ramifications of it how you need to, right? But yet you see people constantly online defending Nintendo as if it's just some sort of great company that does no wrong. When in reality, if the shit that they do and like the way that they act towards the consumer and in towards like emulators and shit, if that was Activision or, you know, 2K or any of these other massive gaming publishers and companies, people would be throwing a bitch fit. People would be rioting. People would have plenty to say. Oh, look at what Activision's doing, man. They're going after the consumer. You know, people would be up in fucking arms and pitchforks about it. But because the people who made Mario and Zelda are doing the douchey thing of the hour, suddenly people want to plug their ears and scream, la la la, I'm not listening about it. And it's just fucking ridiculous. So ultimately, what does this all teach us, okay? First and foremost, emulation is 100% legal. Don't let people lie to you. Don't listen to these fucking idiots online. Creating software that runs these games and shit is not illegal. Now, if they were shipping, like, for instance, the PS2 emulator, you can't just pick it out of an installation or whatever, out of a file and play it. You have to go get the official PlayStation 2 BIOS from Sony's website, and then you have to install it to that emulator in order to play it, because technically, if the people making the emulator provided you with the BIOS to the PS2, then they are providing Sony's copyrighted IP or whatever, their technology, their product. So people, I feel like, really have these opinions when they're not the people emulating and they don't know what they're doing. They have no idea what they're talking about, and they just feel brand loyalty to Nintendo because it's Nintendo, right? Like, they've made so many cool games, and I get that, but like, just because that's the case doesn't mean that they should be given excuses for treating their consumers and people in general like shit. So I don't know, man. With that being said, thank you guys for watching. If you did enjoy, make sure to leave a like. Subscribe if you're brand new around here on the channel. Follow me over on Twitter and Twitch at @SubToOptimus. Make sure to check out Shoptimus down below. Thank you to my Watch Optimus subscribers. Your support helps the channel tremendously. And until my next video, guys, this is Optimus. Well, talking about Nintendo being anti-consumer and signing out.